everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the recorded version of the IMAcc interview prep workshop for the spring of 2022. If we have not met before, my name is Jamie Mickelson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Career Engagement with the Undergraduate Business Program. And a big part of my portfolio and the work that I do is career coaching specifically for the accounting and the MAC students. So thank you for tuning in. We have a lot to cover, so let's just jump in. Okay, so the agenda for the workshop today, first we're going to talk through interview logistics, basics of what to expect, and then we'll spend the bulk of the video talking about preparation, steps you can be taking now to prepare for any range of interviews that you anticipate participating in this spring. A couple questions we will specifically focus on. We will spend some time talking about that first impression question or the tell me about yourself. And we'll also spend some time talking about how to prepare for and practice for the common behavioral based questions that you may see. And I'll talk about some other questions that may pop up during your IMAcc interviews. And then we will wrap up by summarizing next steps. And I'll have sort of a checklist of things to do prior to your first interview. Okay, so as far as interview logistics go, let's start with the when. So interviews will be taking place between Wednesday, March 2nd through Thursday, March 10th. So as far as when interviews get scheduled, as you know, you probably recently submitted your applications. It's a pretty tight window for employers to review applications and then begin sending invites to students. So my first kind of to-do item for all of you is to ensure that you have the correct notifications set up within Handshake. Well, I shouldn't say most. Some of the employers will be utilizing Handshake to schedule their interviews. So you want to ensure that you have the proper notifications turned on so that if and when you are invited to interview through Handshake, you are pinged in whatever way is most appropriate for you, whether that's just through a Handshake notification if you're checking that platform regularly. But most likely, if you haven't already done so, you'll want to set it up so you get an email ping if you are invited to interview. I'm not sure if that's the default, so just something to go in and check. However, not all employers are going to use Handshake to schedule their interviews. Many have their own platforms that they pay for, especially if they're planning to conduct virtual interviews. They'll probably schedule them in a different way. So I'd say over the next couple weeks, very important to keep an eye on Handshake and keep an eye on your email so you can schedule those interviews at times that work best for you. As far as the where, in this kind of post-pandemic world, we're giving employers flexibility and the choice of whether or not they want to come in person for interviews or they want to conduct those interviews virtually. And I haven't yet heard a ton of feedback from employers on which they're going to choose. So we're going to talk today about preparing for both. I have a feeling most students will participate in both. If you are invited to participate in an in-person interview, that will take place on the third floor of Granger Hall in our interview suite, 3295 Granger Hall. If you have not been to our interview suite before and you have an interview scheduled in person, feel free to come by our office, which is 3290 Granger Hall, and just ask if you can, ask the person who's sitting up front if you can do a quick walkthrough and familiarize yourself with the space. It's basically a long hallway with lots of little rooms that employers can reserve to conduct interviews in person. If employers choose to conduct their interviews virtually, that won't necessarily occur within Handshake. The employer will be responsible for choosing a web conferencing platform and providing students with the link to join that interview at the right time. As far as the who will be conducting your interview, typically a partner of those public firms will be conducting the interview or a recruiter will conduct the interview. For in-person, typically what you can expect is the recruiters that you've become very familiar with more serve as a greeter and someone who's kind of overseeing the logistics of the day of interview process. So you might briefly see a recruiter. They'll take you back to the room, and then someone else, like a partner or an associate, will be the one conducting the interview. As far as a couple things to consider, For a virtual interview, you'll want to make sure you're choosing a neutral background. You definitely don't want something in your background that's distracting to the person conducting the interview. I highly recommend doing a test call ahead of time using whatever platform the employer tends to use. And this is becoming very familiar with students, but it doesn't hurt to test Zoom, test WebEx, whatever platform they plan to use. Look at your background and make sure it looks the way that you intend for it to look. Regardless of whether you're in person or virtual, you'll want to wear professional attire. Um, do your best, work with what you've got here on campus, but I'd say, again, dress for the job you want. So if you do have um, suit, jacket, blazer, tie, I would go the full 9 yards. It's better to be overdressed than underdressed. And even in regards to virtual interviews, I'd put the full outfit together. I know it's tempting to want to do slippers and pajama pants, but I think it helps you get into that mode of, I am a professional, I'm a competent person, and I'm going to rock this interview if you've put the whole outfit together. Okay, some comments from last year's class, just to speak to maybe what to expect in your upcoming interviews. One student shared with me there were way more behavioral questions than they had expected. Another student had shared to me they were not asked a single behavioral-based interview question. Another student commented the style of each firm is quite different. Some were really behavioral-based, some are really casual. I think that captures it really well. And finally, another student shared that the interview felt way too laid back and conversational. So what should you gather from this? It's difficult to know what to expect. I expect a range of possibilities. Depending on who is conducting the interview, some partners on one end of the spectrum are very casual, very laid back. This is more of a conversation to get to know you, and they are more evaluating fit, just based on what I would consider more of like a coffee chat, just getting to know you. They may not have any pre-planned questions. One really good example of this that I didn't put on the slide, one student shared with me that on their resume they had an interest section down at the bottom and had something about being really interested in fishing listed in that interest section. And for 45 minutes, that student and the partner talked about fishing. Where do you go fishing? Um, you know, do you travel? Who do you fish with? They spent the entire time talking about that one thing. So that's one extreme example. But on the other hand, there are partners or recruiters who are more by the book. They have their pre-planned set of questions. They may have a rubric to evaluate students with. So my advice, we'll talk about today kind of how to prepare for the full range of interviews. But I don't want you to lose sleep over not knowing what to expect with each interview. I think going with the attitude of I'm going to mirror the interviewer. If they are very casual, I can tone it back and I can be a bit casual too. I can make small talk. I can engage in a conversation. If they're more formal, you can flip that switch of, okay, now I'm a competent professional. I'm going to answer these questions in a very articulate way. So we'll prepare for all the things today. So the big question on everyone's minds is, how do I prepare for my IMAcc interview? So the next several slides are going to jump into these 3 bullet points in more detail. But 3 main steps to preparing for an interview. Number 1, assessing yourself, then assessing the employer, and then bringing the 2 together and assessing the fit. So starting with assessing yourself, employers are most interested in candidates who can articulate what they want and can confidently express what they're good at and what their goals are. So we'll talk about specifically steps you can take to assess yourself. Next, assessing the employer. So employers are also looking for candidates who have researched the firm/company and can prove it. This is a step you've already taken if you've been participating in the networking events, info sessions, career fairs, but we'll talk about additional steps that you can take over the next few days to continue assessing your employer options. And then finally, bringing the two together, assessing the fit. Employers are looking for candidates who can show enthusiasm for the job, the function or the industry, and the firm or the company. So what makes candidate A a great fit for this particular role at this particular company? So let's jump into more detail on assessing yourself. Assessing yourself. So these are some questions to start to reflect on over the next couple days. Whether you are a note taker or whether this is just something you brainstorm in your head, these are just some questions to get you thinking. First of all, what skills do you have that you like to use? I think this goes beyond just what are you good at, but also what skills do you enjoy using in a work setting? What interests you and keeps you motivated at work? How would you describe your ideal job? What does it look like? What features does it have? What makes it the best fit for you? What are your goals, both short-term, long-term, workplace goals, but also personal goals? And finally, what gives you personal satisfaction in a job? So in my in-person workshop, this is where I would pause for a moment and force you all to take out a sheet of paper and jot down some notes answering some of these questions. Now, you don't have to have detailed paragraph responses to each of these questions, but this is just a good brainstorming exercise to start thinking about what are your skills, interests, values, goals, what gives you satisfaction in a job. So I'm going to recommend that you pause the video here and answer some of these questions. Next, assessing the employer. As I mentioned, if you've already been really active in participating in these coffee chats, networking events, career fairs with the employers, this step should feel mostly complete. However, I've met with a lot of you over the last couple weeks, and many of you have been asking questions about how do I differentiate company A from company B? I'm getting very run-of-the-mill responses. So if you're still in the process of exploring employers, let's go back to this slide. This is where you can really start to differentiate one employer from the next. So I recently had a conversation with a student, I'm going to use this as an example, who was doing some self-reflection and realized something, to answer this third question, how would you describe your ideal job? This student really thrives on frequent feedback from her employer. So for instance, she really thrives in an environment where she can receive like weekly check-ins, weekly updates with her employer to know, what are her strengths, what does she need to work on, and just keep that really transparent and open line of communication with her supervisor. With that in mind, she started asking the recruiters and the partners, what does feedback look like at your firm? And she received very different responses. One firm said, oh, we do have weekly one-on-ones with supervisors where we talk about, strengths, what's going on for the week, what you can improve on. And from a different firm, she got the complete opposite response of, we meet quarterly to talk about performance. So that was one very specific thing that was important to this particular student, but can really make a difference in identifying what company is going to be a good fit. To provide another example, I met with another student who identified that she does not like to work in isolation, does not like to, kind of be given a task, put her head down, and work on that completely by herself, and then get the next task and do the same thing. She really thrives in a team-oriented environment where she can collaborate, build off of her strengths and the strengths of others. So she was able to craft questions for the employers specific to that interest. So think about what are the make it or break it items for you on your list. What's going to help differentiate company A from company B, especially if you've been getting some pretty standard responses from employers? How can you make your questions more specific? And even if you're past the point of networking and coffee chats, This is really going to be helpful as you're thinking about questions that you do have for the employer in your final interview stage, because it's kind of your last shot, at least as part of this recruiting process, to ask some of these really tailored questions. So as far as assessing the employer, beyond what you've already been doing, you can continue to gather information over the next couple days from people in the field. So feel free to reach out if you need help making connections, if you're like, I'd really like to talk to, I don't know, an audit associate at PwC Chicago. We've sent a lot of students through the IMAcc program to a lot of these firms in different cities, so likely we can help find a connection. So if you don't feel like you have all your questions answered, continue reaching out to people in the field, peers, alumni, as well as faculty. You can also gather information from the company website and outside resources, such as these that are listed down below. You can gather some information on Handshake. Some alumni and students have provided company reviews that can be really valuable. Glassdoor is another place I like to recommend, but you have to kind of take the information with a grain of salt. Typically, when you think about people leaving reviews of a company, it's similar to leaving a review of a restaurant. You're only going to write a review if you had a really exceptionally positive experience or a very negative, poor experience. So take it with a grain of salt, but I think sometimes reading enough reviews between Handshake and Glassdoor, you can start to at least gather themes of either this is a thing I should be aware of or a red flag, or this is a positive thing that has come up over and over again. Another website I recommend you check out is Vault. It's called Career Insider. Vault provides some really just kind of quick bite-sized resources regarding the firm's rankings, if that's important to you. So that would be another thing to consider checking out. Things to consider as you are doing some employer research. Kind of go through this checklist and see, am I familiar with all of these things related to the organizations I'm pursuing? So first being, what are the positions available and what are the career paths? But also, what is the career trajectory? What does promotion look like at each organization? Also, issues and trends, things that are current events, things that are going on within the organization. It's good to look at, a LinkedIn feed or even a Google News feed to just see what's been happening at this organization over the last year. Organizational structure. So again, what does hierarchy look like? How do I get to be a partner? How long does that take? Organization history, work environment, and this is where you have to get really specific with your questions, otherwise you'll get run-of-the-mill responses. Management and feedback style. I'll tell you, salary ranges in terms of Big Four are going to be very, very similar. If you're looking for more specific data, feel free to reach out to me or another career coach. We're happy to pull data from previous classes just to give you a sense of what to expect in terms of salary ranges. Philosophy and culture, again, you have to ask really specific questions to get at this, and future plans of the organization. I think this is where we've seen the biggest shift during COVID, is in organizational culture and sort of how these firms plan to operate in a post-COVID world. So these are good things to consider if you don't have all these types of questions answered yet. Okay, and then bringing the two together, assessing the fit. So these particular questions, again, I'm going to recommend you pause the video and think through right now. These are very fundamental questions that basically answer, why are you here? Why are you interviewing for this role? And some feedback I've received from students is these questions in particular were asked directly in the interview. So I'm going to recommend pausing and thinking through these 4 questions. Number 1, why do you want to work in accounting? What brought you here in the first place? Thinking back to, is it someone in your family that recommended you look into accounting? Was it an awesome teacher that you had in high school? Is it a relation to your skills or values? just thinking about how you can confidently articulate why accounting is the best fit. And then building on that, what draws you to this particular function? Audit, tax, advisory, corporate accounting, depending on what you are targeting. Again, being able to really confidently articulate why this function. The thing I want to emphasize here is what they are not asking is why not a different function. So for example, I've done a lot of mock interviews with students where I'll ask this question of, why do you want to do audit? And the answer I think I've gotten probably 8 times out of 10 is, well, I don't like tax. Like, okay, that's fair, but it's not a great answer because you're still not really getting to the root of the question of why is audit a good fit. You know, I don't want it to come across that you chose this function by default. So thinking about what are the features of this particular functional area, going back to assessing yourself, why am I a good fit for this functional area? Not why am I a bad fit for the other option. And then what is it about this firm or company that appeals to you? So that's where that deep dive research we just talked about on the last slide is really going to come in handy. They all say they have great people. They all say similar things. But if you can really get to the root of like, this is why EY is the best fit for me versus all of the others, that's going to stand out. So think about what is it about this particular firm that appeals to you as a unique individual. And finally, why do you want to work in this location? This year especially, I see a lot of a huge range of locations that you all are targeting. So being able to articulate to an employer how you chose this particular city, it's not a life sentence. You know, if you get a job here, you're going to be stuck in Seattle, for instance, for the rest of your life. But hopefully you've given it a bit of thought about like, why is this location appealing for you for at least the short term? Okay, so let's jump into another question that I can almost guarantee, kind of regardless of whether the interview is more casual or more formal, I can almost guarantee you're going to get some kind of tell me about yourself question. And the reason we spend so much time talking about this question is because it's usually the first question you're going to get. Therefore, it really is laying the foundation for the rest of your interview. And that first impression is so important. I'm not going to make up a statistic, but they've done studies in the past just to evaluate how quickly an employer made a decision about a candidate in the interview. And it's usually within the first couple minutes. So that's not meant to scare you, but I think this is the biggie. If you're only going to practice for one question, this is the one, because you want to lay that solid foundation for the rest of your interview and make a really stellar first impression. So answering your tell me about yourself should include these 4 ingredients. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this order. I don't want you to come across as robotic. You know, answer it in the way that makes sense for you, but I wanted to cover kind of 4 basic pieces that I think should be part of your tell me about yourself if you're looking to kind of tailor this response. So start off with the basics, the things that you know best, the essentials about yourself. So your name, they're familiar with your year in school, your major, but any of those kind of key details that they need to know about you right off the bat. Then plans for the future. So I'm interested in a career in blank. So be as specific as you can here. You know, I'm interested in an advisory position at a regional firm in, you know, the Milwaukee area. I'm making this up, but be as specific as you can, sort of what are your plans for the future, and that should obviously align with the position that you're interviewing for. Next, steps you've taken to get there. So this is where you start to outline key pieces of your resume and tell this story in the way that it makes sense for you. Do you start at the beginning, starting with things you did as a freshman to things you're doing now? Do you start with your most relevant experiences that you're doing now and work your way backwards? That's up to you, but here's where you can highlight any relevant co-curricular things that you're doing, leadership experience that you have, and any prior employment that is relevant to the job you're applying for. And then finally, the company fit. This is where I think a lot of students stop prior to getting to this part. They talk about themselves because that's what the question asked. What I'm going to recommend you do to take your response from like a B+ to an A is to highlight right away in the tell me about yourself, why are you a great match for each other? So we just talked about this on the last slide. Why is this job at this firm in this location the best fit for you? And if you've paused the video and gone through these exercises, you should start to be forming that answer. But why are we a great match for each other? So this is where you can highlight some of the things we talked about on the assess yourself slide. What are your skills, interests, values, motivators, and why is that a great match for this particular role? Again, I think that makes students really stand out. It shows that you're really intentional about choosing this position that you applied for, and makes a really great first impression. So general guidelines for the tell me about yourself. Keep it brief. It should be about 60 to 90 seconds in length. You don't necessarily need to time yourself. If it's helpful just to see if you're in that range one time, but you don't necessarily need to memorize it to keep it to 60 to 90 seconds, just that you're not going on and on. Your tell me about yourself should connect the dots between the items on your resume and the position you're applying for. So we've talked that to death now. Tailor your response. So again, why are you the best fit for this role? So your tell me about yourself, in theory, should sound different in your KPMG audit interview compared to your EY audit interview. It should sound a little bit different, at least in that piece about why you're the best fit for this job. End strong. So now how you plan to wrap up that response. I think this is where students can start to talk in circles. So know how you plan to end your tell me about yourself. And it could be with how your experiences and expertise will benefit the company. That's a great way to end your response. And again, finally, practice your response, but don't memorize it. Don't type out paragraphs. That's just going to stress you out more. If it's comforting to you to have some notes, like I will tend to just bullet point, like with a word or two, what are the key points I want to hit in my tell me about yourself, and then be confident that you know your story better than anyone else, and you don't need to rely on memorization to get through the tell me about yourself. Okay, the other group of questions I want to talk about specifically, because if you do have a more formal interview, this is most likely the style of question you're going to get, is behavioral-based interview questions. And this should probably sound familiar, assuming everyone took General Business 110 or 120. You had the opportunity to practice some behavioral-based questions. But as a reminder, these are the questions that usually begin with, tell me about a time when you did blank, or give me an example of a time you did X, Y, or Z. So you are basically illustrating your skills with past examples. Another way to think about behavioral-based questions is past behavior equals future behavior. So what a behavioral-based question is not is a hypothetical. Tell me how you would handle this situation if you encountered it. As employers or as recruiters have done research, they've found that those hypothetical questions are almost completely useless. Anyone can make up an answer to how they might respond to a situation, but if you're asked to draw from past behavior and illustrate it with an example of something that actually happened, that's a much better predictor of future behavior in a job. So thinking about how to prepare for these behavioral-based questions, start by thinking of, what do you want them to know? If you have 45 minutes with an interviewer, think about, what would I be disappointed if I didn't get to tell by the end of my interview? So think of the stories that you want to tell. I'm going to say roughly 6 examples that illustrate the qualities that they're looking for. So the question is, what are the qualities that they're looking for? You might have the answer key. So this is just one example. It's a screenshot of an older post from 2020 for an audit internship with Deloitte. So look back at your applications and see if the firm provided a thorough job description. Some are better than others. I know they've been kind of combining posts and Handshake where it's like all internships are posted under one place. And I think the disadvantage of that is you lose some of these really specifically written job descriptions. But it can be as simple as a Google search too, just to look for, audit internship at XYZ company, and you can find something that looks like this. So this position description, in theory, should outline exactly the knowledge, skills, and abilities that this employer is seeking. So if the employer plans to ask behavioral-based questions, I can almost guarantee they'll look back at the job description that they wrote as they're planning questions for the candidates. So my advice would be, looking at that job description, I'm a visual person, so I like to make tables or, something that's really easy to take notes in. I would make a list of, okay, I read through the job description. What are the position requirements that seem really important in this role? And it might be a mix of hard skills and soft skills. So using that position description from the last slide, that audit position, I identified, 5 hard skills. So things like auditing financials, applying concepts of risk, using audit tools. So you see that at the top. And then there was also a mix of soft skills. So things like communication skills, leadership, problem solving, experience working independently, managing conflicting priorities. So take a look at the job description and see if you can identify what are the key skills and abilities that they're seeking in a candidate. Then once you've gone through that exercise, that's when you pull up your resume and start to think about, okay, how have I demonstrated these skills through past experiences? So this might be a class project example. It could be from a previous internship or work experience. It could be part of your student org or your part-time job. It should come from a variety of places. But this is where you can start to jot down notes of, oh, I do have these skills and I've demonstrated them in these ways. And start to brainstorm examples of stories you could tell to illustrate these qualities. So this exercise that I just illustrated will be most useful if you're able to identify the job description specifically for the role in which you're interviewing for. And many of the firms did provide either in Handshake or on their website very thorough job descriptions where you can get at some of those bullet points and identify what are the key skills and abilities that they're seeking in a candidate. However, if you are unlucky and do not have a thorough job description to refer to, I want to do at least help come up with a starting point. So I put together this list of 5 very common skills that I've seen across pretty much all functional areas within accounting that employers are seeking. So that being complex problem solving skills, communication skills, and the ability to communicate with a wide variety of audiences, attention to detail, team orientation, and technical skills or technical competence. So if you do not have a job description to work from, this could be a good starting point, but I recommend trying to find something more specific first. So just to recap, this would be another really great place to pause the video if you're doing your interview prep right now. Go into Handshake or go into the company website, identify the job description, and start to highlight or take note of what are those key competencies, both hard and soft skills that they're seeking, and then start to jot down notes about your qualifications. An additional note on behavioral-based interview questions. This should look familiar to many of you, the STAR method. So the STAR method, which stands for Situation, Task, Action, Result, is basically a framework for responding to behavioral-based interview questions. So this framework basically allows you to hit all of the key details, but knowing what points should I be touching on and knowing when to stop. So to illustrate this, starting with the situation. So when you are asked about, let's see, please, can you give me an example of a time when you had to manage conflicting priorities? So this is a question about time management skills. So in your example, first of all, what is the situation? Are you talking about an internship? Are you talking about your part-time job? Are you talking about a student org that you're a part of? And then next T, task, what were the challenges or the expectations? What was the problem that you had to solve? Next, you're talking about your action. So this is where you're elaborating on what you did specifically in this scenario and how did you do it. This is important, especially with any question that's getting at um, a team orientation type question, focusing on, okay, your team may have done these things, but what was your specific contribution to that team? So remembering to focus on you and your skills. And then finally, the result. So how does this story end? Kind of tying it up nicely with a bow. So did you get an A on the project? Did you make a process at your internship more efficient? Describe the results, quantify where it's appropriate, talk about what you accomplished for yourself, the group, or the organization. So my recommendation is when you're going through this exercise and you're starting to come up with examples of stories that demonstrate qualifications, I tend to note take in the STAR method. So rather than writing paragraphs about a certain story, just write down, okay, I'm going to talk about my summer 2021 internship. Um, yeah, that is last year. I'm going to talk about my summer 2021 internship when I had to create this new program from scratch. These are the specific steps that I took to create this program, and ultimately it was implemented at the company. That's a terrible example, but really just brief bullet points that touch on the S, T, A, and the R. So then when you are presented with a question in the interview, you can quickly look down at your notes and see a couple examples using the STAR method. I think when you organize your notes that way, you're more likely to answer and respond using that structure. So next I want to highlight a couple other potential questions that you may see in your interview and talk about just in general how to respond to them. So the first being resume questions. So this tends to be more of the informal interview. Perhaps there isn't a predetermined list of questions that the person is working from. So they're just going to go through your resume line by line and ask, tell me about this thing. So one example is, oh, I see last semester you were the financial director of Sports Business Club. Tell me about that. Like it's a very broad question and it's not necessarily a behavioral based interview question, but you can respond like it is a behavioral based interview question. So when you get these types of broad sweeping resume questions, focus on your skills. So what skills did you gain? What skills did you learn in XYZ thing or position that they're asking about? And in order to give your response a bit of structure, I recommend still utilizing the STAR method when answering these questions. So when you go through that exercise of planning some stories, most likely if you did have a leadership position in Sports Business Club, you probably have some story about it. Tell that story, and you can illustrate other skills along the way that you gained from that position. Other types of questions you might get, again, in more informal interviews are these conversational questions. So I listed a handful of examples here, such as what are your strengths and weaknesses? What's your greatest accomplishment? How would you describe yourself? Well, I don't think you necessarily need to prepare sort of canned responses for each of these questions. I think going through that exercise at the very beginning of the video where we talked about brainstorming what are your strengths, what are your skills that you like to use, what motivates you, what are your values, can be really helpful in addressing some of these more general conversational questions. Okay, some final notes on what to do before the very fun and exciting interview process that is coming up shortly. Practicing. So Uh, first step you can do is be able to anticipate what type of questions you're going to get. So use your resources in order to make your best educated guess on what types of questions you'll be asked. You can do this in a variety of ways. You can utilize company websites or Glassdoor to identify questions. Some of the big four firms have fully built out websites that have videos and blog posts about how to prepare for an interview at XYZ company. So you have those resources at your fingertips, so utilize them. They're there for a reason. And that means the company's pretty consistent in their process. But you can also use your networking contacts. You can utilize alumni just to ask, like, oh, I know you did an interview with KPMG. Tell me what that experience was like. So do your best to try and anticipate what the interview will be like. But again, kind of going through all these exercises, you'll be prepared for just about anything. Practice, but I should have put an asterisk next to this. What I don't want you to do is Google, 50 questions I could be asked in an interview and stay up all night practicing or preparing responses for all of those questions. I think that's exhausting and it's just going to stress you out, especially when you're asked a question that you did not prepare for and then you have to think on your feet. I think it's honestly best not to do that. So instead, practice the tough questions. So you can Google that list of, top 50 most popular interview questions. Instead of practicing all of them, just practice the ones that would stump you. So I think it's really important to practice the tell me about yourself. We've talked about that, one being a biggie. But what are some of the other questions that might stump you? So this might be your strengths and weaknesses question. It might be a question about goals. It might be a specific quality or skill that the employer wants you to illustrate through a behavioral-based interview question. So just practice the tough ones, but I really don't think it's worth trying to practice 20 plus responses. It's just going to stress you out. And then finally, participating in a mock interview. So all of the career coaches in my office are armed and ready to help you prepare for these interviews. I have put together a set of mock interview questions specifically for the IMAcc students. And this list was put together based on feedback from former students, feedback from employers. I'm trying to cover all the bases with this list of mock interview questions. So I have provided that list to all of the career coaches, so you don't need to meet with me, especially if we've met several times. I think it's actually better to meet with someone else. So feel free to schedule an appointment with a career coach to participate in a mock interview, and they're all prepared to help you with that. Okay, some additional final thoughts. This is a big one, preparing questions for them. I think I've heard from just about all of you, you're running out of questions, and I don't blame you. You've kind of been through the ringer with between the career fair and coffee chats and networking events. I know you're running out of ideas. So it doesn't excuse you from having good questions, however, in that final interview. So one kind of final thing to think about if you are feeling burnt out on asking questions is jump all the way back to that slide where we talked about self-assessment. One thing as we're coming down to the wire here, and I mentioned this before, is what's going to be a deal breaker for you when it comes to the ranking of your firms. So think about what's a unique trait to you. I know I provided the example already about one student who the way her employer provides feedback was a make it or break it. Another student who a make it or break it was completely working in isolation. I'll provide one more example. I worked with a student who said, she's really trying to get at the culture of the company, but asking questions like, describe the company culture was really getting her nowhere, because generally employers are answering them the same. So thinking about what's a question I can ask where there is a right and a wrong answer, like there's a question or an answer that you are hoping for. So for example, that student, I advised her to ask, tell me what lunch looks like at this company. That's a very specific question. The right answer in her mind is that it's a very social engagement. People step away from their offices, step away from their desks, step away from their work, potentially go out into the city, find a restaurant to go to, get to know each other, versus the wrong answer in her perspective would be, people typically eat or work through lunch. People typically or eat at their desks. So think about what are questions I can ask that there is a right and a wrong answer, and it's going to help me differentiate firm A from firm B from firm C. So start to think about those really specific questions that are unique to you that maybe you haven't gotten to ask yet. Also, be a good listener. So it's important. I think it's easy to get in your own head and start to think about how you're going to respond before you even hear the full question, but be sure you're answering the questions that they're asking. If you need to take a moment to think about your response, it's okay. Say, oh, that's a really great question. I'm going to pause for a moment and think on that. If you don't understand the question or you need them to repeat it, it is totally okay to ask them to repeat the question or did you mean this? Clarify what they meant by the question just to ensure you don't end up spiraling off in a direction that is not helpful for either party. Also, be yourself. So answer questions truthfully, be authentic, and be genuine. Don't pretend to be someone that you're not. If you feel like you have to pretend to be someone that you're not in an interview to get through it, then maybe that's not the best company fit for you. So be yourself. And finally, follow up. So sending a thank you note is always appreciated. An email is totally acceptable if you really want to take a step above and write a handwritten thank you note. For an in-person interview, we do have thank you notes available in our office, 3290 Granger Hall. If you want to pop by after your interview, quickly fill out a thank you note, we can ensure that that thank you note gets to the employer. But I think that can go a long way just in showing that you appreciate their time. Okay, final thoughts. You all are putting in a ton of work. You've been networking your butts off. You've been asking really thoughtful questions. I don't think anyone needs to lose sleep over this interview process. I'd say if you want to go back to the beginning of the video, if you didn't go through the exercises yet, go through the motions, prepare some stories, practice your tell me about yourself, prepare a few questions for them, and then get some sleep and rest. If you think you would benefit from the practice, again, career coaches are available to help with a mock interview. Feel free to schedule a double appointment. It looks different on different folks' calendars depending on how we set it up. You can either schedule an hour-long appointment or a back-to-back, 2 30-minute appointments. It doesn't matter, but just to ensure you have enough time for a full mock interview. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about the content from this video or anything else related to IMAcc. But I wish you all the best in this process, and I know you're going to nail it.